Hello and welcome to Thomas Becket and TS Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. My name is Naomi Speakman, co-curator of the exhibition Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint, and it is my pleasure to host this discussion. This event was commissioned by the British Museum Learning Department to complement the exhibition. The City Lit kindly tailored a course for drama students using TS Eliot's play Murder in the Cathedral as a focus of study, which you'll be hearing more about shortly. So the format of this event is for me to briefly set the historical scene for Becket and Henry II's dispute and the Archbishop's shocking murder. Then Phoebe Braithwaite, tutor in English literature at the City Lit, will explain the context of this play and why it was created in the 1930s. Then Gary Grant, drama tutor at the City Lit, will discuss the challenges of directing the play for film. Our event will conclude with excerpts from the play, acted by the brilliant students on the City Lit course, and these have been filmed by the City Lit. So let's begin with the history, and I'm going to give you a potted history of Thomas Becket in about 6 minutes. Becket was born about 20 minutes away from where I'm sitting in the British Museum now. He was born on Cheapside in late December 1120 to Gilbert and Matilda, who were two immigrants from Normandy. He lived in and around the City of London for about the first 25 years of his life, except for a 3-year period when he went to Paris to study. When he was a young man, he was thrust into the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, and he gained a position in the household through contacts, ability, and some luck. There, he joined a group of ambitious and intellectual young men, and Becket stayed in the household for about a decade. Canterbury Cathedral at the time was a powerhouse of artistic and intellectual patronage, and during his time with the Archbishop, Becket also was sent to the continent. He visited the papal curia, and he also studied law in Bologna and at Auxerre. In 1154, a new king came to the throne. This was the young Henry II. Henry was gaining his throne after a period of brutal civil war fought between Henry's mother, Matilda, and King Stephen. So, as Henry took the throne, he needed new men around him that he could trust. And he looked to the Archbishop of Canterbury for recommendations, and Theobald recommended Becket, his clerk, for the position of Chancellor. This Henry accepted, and Becket became the king's right-hand man and one of the most senior courtiers of the time, as well as one of England's leading administrators. Becket was Henry's chancellor for about 8 years, and it's said that the two during that time became great friends. Becket lived quite a secular life during this period. He fought on the king's behalf, he hunted, he was known for wearing fine clothes and living a very lavish lifestyle. So it was quite a surprise to many, Becket included, when in 1162 Henry nominated him to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. This was following Theobald's death. The king's plan was that his chancellor would hold on to that job whilst also becoming archbishop. So it came as a surprise to the king, a surprise and a disappointment, when Henry was appointed archbishop and almost immediately rejected the chancellorship. It's said that when he was consecrated to the role, Becket had a change of heart and a change of conscience and entirely committed himself to the cause of the church. Certainly, he threw off some of the aspects of his previously secular lifestyle. For example, he was known for wearing a hair shirt underneath his vestments. It took about 2 years for Becket and Henry's friendship to fall apart. The rejection of the chancellorship was the first stage, but they clashed about several matters. The most well-known and important of these is the case of criminous clerks. Now, at the time, there was a dual court system, ecclesiastical courts and the secular courts. And people in the church were tried by the ecclesiastical courts, which had a reputation for leniency. Henry wanted clerics accused of serious crimes not to be tried in ecclesiastical courts, but in his own. Becket vigorously defended the rights of the church to maintain this system. And the issue was a bigger one than just this matter of courts. To Becket and his supporters, Henry was trying to overstep his authority, something akin to tyranny. The question of justice and good rulership and tyranny was one that people were very concerned with in the mid-12th century, so this was a bigger matter at its heart. In 1164, Becket was brought before the king and accused of crimes dating from his time as chancellor, such as the embezzlement of money. It's thought that these were trumped-up charges, but Becket feared for his life, and in secret he fled England and made his way to the safety of the continent. There he lived in France for 6 years. He lived in France for 6 years, and various leaders tried to intervene to restore the relationship between Henry and Becket, such as the Pope Alexander III and Louis, the King of France. One of the most serious moments in Becket's 6 years in exile came in mid-1170, and this was when the king, Henry II, wanted to have his son, also named Henry, crowned joint monarch. This was a way of securing his succession. But with the Archbishop of Canterbury overseas, he was not around to preside over the coronation ceremony. Instead, 3 other men presided over proceedings: the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, and the Bishop of Salisbury. When Becket heard about this, he was furious. It was the ancient right of the Archbishop of Canterbury to perform coronation ceremonies. Later in 1170, Becket and Henry agreed a fragile peace, and Becket decided to return to England. But before he did so, he issued sentences of excommunication against those men involved in the coronation ceremony of Henry the young king. So this is the moment when TS Eliot's play begins, as Becket arrives back in Canterbury after 6 long years in exile. But as Becket arrived back in Canterbury, things did not look good, because Henry, who was in Normandy at the time, heard the news about the excommunications and flew into a rage. And this was the moment when Henry is said to have uttered those legendary words, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" Now that's most likely a later invention by historians, but what the king said is not too different. We don't know exactly what those words were, but Henry said something along the lines of, "Becket is causing me problems, and why has no one done anything about it?" 4 knights present at the court heard these words and took it upon them to go to Canterbury and arrest Becket on the king's behalf. They arrived in Canterbury on the 29th of December, 1170. At first, they came to Becket in his archbishop's palace, which was next door to the cathedral. There, they demanded that Becket went with them, but he refused. A huge argument erupted, with insults being hurled from both sides. In anger, the knights left, and they went to gather weapons and armour. Becket made his way through the cloister into the sanctuary of the cathedral. But in hot pursuit, the knights soon followed, and it is there that a tussle took place, and Becket was struck down. The fatal moment was when the top of Becket's crown was sliced from his head, a very brutal act. There were many eyewitnesses to the crime, and 5 of them wrote down what they saw, and it's thanks to them that we know so much about the event. And it's also thanks to one, Edward Grimm, that TS Eliot drew upon his account. Grimm we could think of as the hero of the moment, because he is the only man who actually stepped forward to defend Becket, and in doing so he was cut in the arm by one of the knight's swords, and it was nearly severed. Almost immediately after his death, Becket was said to be working miracles. In fact, one biographer wrote that the first miracle happened that very night. Many of the miracles were associated with the healing properties of Becket's blood. Over the course of 3 or 4 years, hundreds of miracle stories were recorded by the monks at Canterbury, told to them by pilgrims who came to visit Becket's tomb in the crypt. About 2 years and 2 months after the murder, Becket was canonised St. Thomas of Canterbury. At the time, it was one of the fastest canonisations in history, and it put Canterbury Cathedral on the map as one of Europe's most popular and well-known pilgrimage destinations. Okay, so let's move on to T.S. Eliot's play, and let's start with you, Phoebe. Why was T.S. Eliot drawn to write a play on this subject at this time?
Thanks, Naomi. I'm going to be talking a little bit now about the literary context, which I hope answers some of those questions as to why Eliot chose to focus on Thomas Becket in his play Murder in the Cathedral. And I wanted to start by talking a bit about the play's immediate context and how it came to be written. It was first commissioned by George Bell, the Bishop of Chichester, for the Canterbury Festival of 1935. Eliot agreed to write the play on the condition that it would be produced by E. Martin Brown, with whom he'd collaborated on the pageant play The Rock, which was performed at Sadler's Wells in 1934, a year before. Eliot chose the martyrdom of Thomas Becket as his theme of his own volition. And I think this was an especially effective choice in light of the fact that it was first performed in the Charter House of the Cathedral in 1935. And as you've said, Naomi, a great deal of the source material for the play was taken from contemporary accounts, and in particular those of Edward Grimm. And a lot of the speech is actually plucked from those sources. However, it's also worth pointing out that it's not a historical play per se, and that a lot of what Eliot was doing, I think, in this text is stripping back some of that historical source and not kind of going through the motions of what happened where and when, but instead trying to create something of a kind of archetype, an archetypical martyr whose story has a universal appeal. And Eliot was thinking a lot in this period about how to communicate to a wider audience, how to get through to people on a kind of slightly more mass scale. And this quote here at the bottom is from something Eliot wrote sort of 15 years after the play, looking back. And he writes, "It was a religious play, and people who go deliberately to a religious play at a religious festival expect to be patiently bored and to satisfy themselves with the feeling that they have done something meritorious. So the path was made easy." I think that sort of elides actually some of the deeper thinking that Eliot was doing in this period, which we'll come on to, about how to communicate to a wider audience. And this play actually did go on to be performed on Shaftesbury Avenue and to have a slightly more mass kind of public. But initially it was definitely performed to a kind of religious audience, a play-going audience. Now to talk about some of the kind of literary context, the wider context in which it was written. This was a period of ferment for poetry, and Eliot was really the signal influence and energy behind that. He'd become a publisher at Faber in 1925, 3 years after the publication of The Wasteland in 1922. He'd been working at a bank when he got that job. And during the 1930s at Faber, Eliot was setting about with a kind of construction or actively kind of cultivating an avant-garde canon, publishing authors like W.H. Auden and Louis MacNeice. And these poets were also thinking quite actively about what a more public kind of poetry would look like. And this led them to experiments in a kind of didactic or political kind of verse that reflected their commitment to communism. Now, that path wasn't Eliot's own path, and he believed in a more conservative way that Britain was moving, or England really was moving kind of out of step with its Christian cultural sources, and that its only kind of path towards redemption or getting it back on track would be to reconnect with those sources. And this play is very much a part of that effort. And he writes in 1939 the idea of a Christian society, which sets out that viewpoint more explicitly. His poetry was also taking those new turns towards the end of the 1920s with the publication of Ash Wednesday and in 1930 Marina. On the screen here, there are some quotes about how he thought of this kind of versification during this period. He writes in 1933, he would like to be something of a popular entertainer and be able to think his own thoughts behind a tragic or a comic mask. He would like to convey the pleasures of poetry not only to a larger audience, but to larger groups of people collectively. And the theatre is the best place in which to do it. And as for what that kind of verse would look like, he writes, we should not be transported into an artificial world. On the contrary, our own sordid, dreary daily world would be suddenly illuminated and transfigured. In terms of what's happening in Eliot's own life at this period, I think it's safe to say it had been a pretty difficult period for him. He'd separated formally from his wife, Vivian Haigh Wood, in 1933 after many unhappy years. And this famous quote at the bottom here talks about that. He says, "I came to persuade myself that I was in love with Vivian simply because I wanted to burn my boats and commit myself to staying in England. And she persuaded herself, also under the influence of Pound, that she would save the poet by keeping him in England. To me, the marriage brought no unhappiness. To her, the marriage brought no unhappiness. To me, it brought the state of mind out of which came the wasteland." And so in 1927, he's baptized and converts to Anglicanism. The same year, he takes British citizenship, and in 1928, he takes a vow of chastity. One critic has said that the baptism and conversion are the kind of path out of the hell of the wasteland and into the preferable purgatory of the later work, of which The Murder in the Cathedral forms a part. And I think it's worth saying that really what Eliot seems to be doing in this period is inscribing himself into an English tradition and thinking about England as a kind of salvation for himself and getting into the kind of notes of its psyche. And something that I think is happening in Murder in the Cathedral, and Robert Crawford in the LRB points out that Eliot always was fascinated with names and with his own name in particular, is that he's thinking of himself as the Thomas figure of Thomas of Becket. So it's not only that the play kind of restages, Becket's assassination and through it, the crucifixion, but Eliot is also thinking about his own sort of spiritual salvation through the Thomas figure in the play. To talk a little about the play itself, I think critics have kind of tried to situate it as this pivotal moment, working towards the kind of salvation verse of the later part of Eliot's career. And he really is concerned with kind of different routes towards a divine or mystical reality that offers him a kind of, like I say, salvation and a release from suffering that he's been going through. And I think Murder in the Cathedral is particularly about this groping towards a kind of symbolic vocabulary that's able to valorize suffering within a Christian idiom, and to find relief from the sense of pain and humiliation and kind of cultural vacuity that are his theme in the earlier part of his career. In the play, I would say that those interests are characterized by a more transparent use of language, and the idea that eventual gain can be won by withstanding suffering is often expressed through paradox and oxymoron. There's also a thematic interest in purgation, which I think is a recycled but kind of repurposed and put to a different end than it is in The Wasteland. And I think you see this in particular at the point when the chorus shouts after Becket's death, "Clear the air, clean the sky, wash the wind, take stone from stone and wash them." I mentioned earlier the poems Ash Wednesday and Marina, and I think Marina gives a kind of sense of this interest in kind of crisscrossing and in finding the kind of still point, what he calls in the four quartets, the still point of the turning world. And in Marina, we have this quote, "Living to live in a world of time beyond me." So I think he's really gearing himself up to this new kind of language that's concerned with this kind of blank themes of sort of time and suffering and action. It's important, I think, to say that Murder in the Cathedral provides the kernel of the first of the four quartets, Burnt Norton, which is published in his collected poems in 1936. And you even see some lines are common between the play and that first of the four quartets, such as "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." This sense of what, this idea of at the still point of the turning world, Neville Coghill, who writes the introduction to this 1965 edition, he says that interest is actually literalized by having Thomas killed by the four knights, in the sense that he's the kind of wheel that then, those spokes go through. So I think it is true, I think that Eliot was interested in that kind of abstraction or symbolic abstraction of what his theme actually was. And one other thing that's worth saying is that Eliot was very keen to avoid the pitfalls of a kind of pseudo-Shakespearean iambic pentameter, which he saw in Tennyson's play on the same theme. And in doing so, he goes back to two kind of pre-Shakespearean antecedents, the late 15th century morality play Everyman, which also presents figures as archetypes, which is obviously part of Eliot's intention here. And also, I think, reviving an interest in Greek folk drama and its emphasis on kind of ritual. To what extent can we say that the play is a success, or how favourably has it been viewed by history? I think one way to approach this question is to look at the kind of afterlives it's had. So in 1951, it was turned into a film by the Austrian director George Hollering, which won a prize that year at the Venice Film Festival. And in 1958, it was turned into an opera by the Italian composer Pizzetti. This quote at the bottom here is from one of Eliot's great critics, Helen Gardner, and she writes, "The attempt to present in Thomas the Martyr is in will and deed, with mind and heart purified, to be made the instrument of the divine purpose, is a bold one. Success is hardly to be expected. There is more than a trace in the Archbishop of the classic prig," she writes. So I think Gardner wasn't quite convinced that Eliot achieved what he set out to achieve, and I think even in Eliot's own kind of appraisal of the play in Poetry and Drama in 1951, he's also not sure of the extent to which it's a kind of dramatic success. Nevertheless, I think we get the kind of development of this transparent language that goes on to be the kind of mainstay of the four quartets. And in that sense, I think it's a kind of very important stage in Eliot's poetic development.
Thank you, Phoebe. That was fascinating. Now we'll turn to Gary. What are the considerations of directing this play?
Considerations of directing this play. The considerations were many. I think when you're directing something for film, there's all of those considerations, particularly with students that haven't worked a great deal in film. All of the sort of filmic subtlety is always, quite a process to build up as part of a skill set. But when you're doing it with TS Eliot verse, now we've got a whole brand new set of problems, because to have that sort of subtlety within that rhythmic writing is harder than it sounds, to not branch out into theatrical performance. So on that front, there was a lot of work to do in rehearsal with the students, because a lot of them had never spent any time in front of a film camera their whole lives. So for them to deliver filmic performances, this is really difficult text to start with. So on that sort of practical performance level, that was a consideration. And really, as we just heard from Phoebe there, the sort of depth of context underneath the text. It's so beautifully written. There's so much underneath it. There's so much behind it. It's how do we honor the writing with a filmic abridged version, because our version is going to be under half an hour. So normally when one directs a piece and you have a script, the writing being brilliant is a good thing. In this instance, the writing being great was kind of annoying, because it's really difficult to remove sections, because it's also beautifully written and nothing's written for no reason. Like there's nothing in there that's just a kind of bridge to the next bit. It's all, there's so much underneath all of the writing. So to remove it, and because it's in verse, when you take sections out, you're in danger of killing the momentum of the verse. So I had to go through with the actors, with the cast, and break down the text all the way through and find what we thought were the most essential parts of the narrative, and build a short piece with those, making sure that those turning points and those beat points were in there, but the sense of rhythm and the sense of charm that T.S. Eliot writes with were all still there. And finally, we wanted to make it accessible. T.S. Eliot is, for someone that's not into literature, for someone who doesn't go to theatre, I think it's hard to read. It's going to be a tough read if you come into it. I tried to read the Critique of Pure Reason once by Immanuel Kant. That's a hard read. And T.S. Eliot, to me, like the theatrical version of that is hard to break into. It's hard to get into. So we wanted to make it accessible and kind of an easy watch in that sense. So we've got it set as a combination of green screen with the Canterbury background, but also it just moves into modern day background. So it just flits around between. So visually, it's quite quirky and bizarre. To retain that sense of interest. That was interesting, that quote there, Phoebe, that he wrote. I haven't read that before, that he'd written afterwards, that almost the religious element almost flagellating themselves slightly by, that's a sort of, there's a beautiful undertone there. But we wanted to make, so the considerations were to have it filmic, to honor the text, to honor the writing, to make sure the rhythmic element of it remained, but also we managed to create something that's filmic. And I think we got there. So yeah, I mean, essentially those were the main considerations. And of course, time. We're shooting a film with that length in one day, which I don't know how much you know about filmmaking, but that's pretty rough. To actually get it done in one day was quite tough. And the students were phenomenal. They were really phenomenal. They analyzed the text beautifully. They understood the truth underneath it. There was nothing I couldn't ask them to do that they wouldn't know how to do in terms of staying truthful to the character and delivering little moments. It gave, I mean, for people that have not been in front of a camera before, and people, the majority of which this was new text to them, they did, well, I think they did extraordinarily well, but I'll let you be the judge. But yeah, they were the main consideration.
Thank you, Gary. And could you tell us more about how difficult it is to interpret this text for film?
In terms of interpreting it for film, it's the same as one would interpret it for the stage. It's then the delivery of that. And because film, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, performance-wise on film, there is a naturalistic element. The film, everything is smaller, more internalized than one would do on the stage. And obviously, delivering dialogue in verse is by its nature a kind of theatrical, it's just a theatrical positioning that you would take with that performance. So to have that sort of naturalistic truth underneath it that's the hurdle to jump with, particularly people that haven't done film before. And the answer to it is kind of the answer that comes down to most good acting, is if they understand the truth of why they're there, if they understand where they've come from, if they understand who they're playing and why they feel the way they feel, there should be some truth underneath what they're saying anyway. So it was just about getting the actors to rein in their temptation to go big and bada-bam and theatrical with it, and just bring it in and make it thoughtful. And then we just use certain little things that will give them an eye line, a thinking space to just turn and think to themselves and then back up. And just these little kind of filmic moves that make the performance more subtle than I think it would naturally be, given the writing. But yeah, so that overcoming, I mean, it was saying overcoming, it was a sort of a glorious process to sort of do that type of writing. What a wonderful thing for an actor to be able to do, deliver characters that are written so beautifully well. But making it filmic, that was, that's the sort of challenge there, which I think that the students got through extraordinarily well. Yeah, I think they did. I'm proud of what they did. I say we have a watch the piece, see what you think. I think they did great.
Here let us stand, close by the cathedral. Here let us wait.
Are we drawn by danger? Is it the knowledge of safety that draws our feet towards the cathedral?
Towards the cathedral? What danger can be for us, the poor women of Canterbury?
With which we are not already familiar. There is no danger for us.
And there is no safety in the cathedral. Some presage of an act
which our eyes are compelled to witness has forced our feet towards the cathedral. We are forced to bear witness.
Since golden October declined into sombre November, and the apples were gathered and stored,
and the land became brown, sharp points of death in a waste of water and mud.
The new year waits, breathes, waits, whispers in darkness.
While the labourer kicks off a muddy boot and stretches his hand to the fire.
"7 years and the summer is over. 7 years since the Archbishop left us."
What does the Archbishop do, and our sovereign Lord the Pope, with the stubborn king and the French king in ceaseless intrigue at one place or another in France?
I see nothing quite conclusive in the art of temporal government, but violence, duplicity, and frequent malversation. King rules or barons rule, the strong man strongly and the weak man by caprice.
I have to inform you, the Archbishop is in England, and is close.
What? Is the exile ended? Is our Lord Archbishop reunited with the King? What reconciliation of two proud men?
What peace can be found to grow between a hammer and the anvil?
Tell us, are the old disputes at an end? Is the wall of pride cast down that divided them? Is it peace or war?
Peace, but not the kiss of peace. A patched up affair, if you ask my opinion.
I fear for the Archbishop. I fear for the Church. I know that the pride bred of sudden prosperity was but confirmed by a bitter adversity. I saw him as Chancellor, flattered by the King, liked or feared by courtiers in their overbearing fashion, despised or despising, always isolated, never one among them, always insecure. His pride always feeding upon his own virtues, pride drawing sustenance from impartiality, pride drawing sustenance from generosity, loathing power granted by temporal devolution, wishing subjection to God alone. Had the king been greater, or had he been weaker, things had perhaps been different for Thomas.
Yet our Lord is returned. Our Lord has come back to his own again. We've had enough of waiting from December to dismal December. The Archbishop shall be at our head, dispelling dismay and doubt. He will tell us what we are to do. He will give us our orders, instruct us. Our Lord is at one with the Pope and also the King of France. We can lean on a rock. We can feel a firm foothold against the perpetual wash of tides, a balance of forces of barons and landholders. The rock of God is beneath our feet. Let us meet the Archbishop with cordial thanksgiving. Our Lord Archbishop returns, and when the Archbishop returns, our doubts are dispelled. Let us therefore rejoice. I say rejoice and show a glad face for his welcome. I am the Archbishop's man. Let us give the Archbishop welcome.
For good or ill, let the wheel turn. For the wheel has been still these past 7 years, and not good. For ill or good, let the wheel turn. For who knows the end of good or evil?
Peace.
Oh, my Lord, forgive me. I did not see you coming. Forgive us, my Lord. You would have had a better welcome if we had been sooner prepared for the event. But your Lordship knows that 7 years of waiting, 7 years of prayer, 7 years of emptiness have better prepared our hearts for your coming than 7 days could make ready Canterbury.
I'm more grateful for all your kind attentions. These are small matters. Little rest in Canterbury with eager enemies restless about us. Rebellious bishops, York, London, Salisbury, would have intercepted our letters. For a little while, the hungry hawk will merely hover and soar, circling lower, waiting excuse, pretense, opportunity. End will be simple, sudden, God-given.
You see, my lord, I do not wait upon ceremony. Here I have come, forgetting all acrimony, remembering all the good times past. Old Tom, gay Tom, Becket of London. Your lordship won't forget that evening on the river when the king and you and I were all friends together. Friendship should be more than biting time can sever. What, my lord? Now that you recover favour with the king, shall we say that the summer's over, or that the good time cannot last? Laughter, apple blossom floating on the water, singing at nightfall, whispering in chambers, fires devouring the winter season, eating up the darkness with wit and wine and wisdom. Now that the king and you are in amity, clergy and laity may return to gaiety. Mirth and sportfulness need not walk warily.
You talk of seasons that are past.
And of the new season, love in the orchard, send the sap shooting. Mirth matches melancholy.
We do not know very much of the future, except that from generation to generation the same things happen again and again. But in the life of one man, never the same time returns. Only the fool fixed in his folly may think he can turn the wheel on which he turns.
My lord, a nod is as good as a wink. For the good times past that have come again, I am yours.
Think of penitence and follow your master.
You were not used to be so hard upon sinners when they were your friends. Be easy, man. The easy man lives to eat the best dinners. Take a friend's advice. Leave well alone, or your goose may get cooked and eaten to the bone.
You come 20 years too late.
Then I leave you to your fate. I leave you to the pleasure of your higher vices, which will have to be paid for at higher prices. If you will remember me, my lord, at your prayers, I'll remember you at kissing time below the stairs.
Your lordship has forgotten me, perhaps. The chancellorship that you resigned when you were made archbishop, that was a mistake on your part. Still may be regained. Think, my lord, power obtained grows to glory, life-lasting, permanent possession. Temple tomb, monument of marble, all over men reckon no madness.
To the man of God, what gladness?
Sadness, only to those giving love to God alone. Power is present, holiness hereafter.
Who then?
The Chancellor. King and Chancellor. King commands, Chancellor richly rules. This is a sentence not taught in the schools. To set down the great, protect the poor. Beneath the throne of God can man do more. Disarm the ruffian, strengthen the laws, rule for the good of the better cause. Dispensing justice make all eveners thrive on earth, and perhaps in heaven. Real power is purchased at price of a certain submission. Your spiritual power is earthly perdition. Power is present for him who will wield.
What shall we give for it?
Pretense of priestly power.
Why should we give it?
For the power and the glory.
No.
Then I leave you to your fate. Your sin soars sunward, covering kings' falcons.
I'm an unexpected visitor.
I expected you.
Well, my lord, I am no trifler and no politician. I know how to hold my estates in order. It is we country lords who know the country, and we who know what the country needs. It is our country. We care for the country. We are the backbone of the nation. We, not the plotting parasites about the king.
For a country lord, you wrap your meaning in as dark generality as any courtier.
This is the simple fact. You have no hope of reconciliation with Henry the King. You look only to blind assertion and isolation. That is a mistake. Other friends may be found in your present situation. King in England is not all-powerful. King is in France, squabbling in Anjou, round him waiting hungry sons. We are for England. We are in England. You and I, my lord, are Normans. England is a land for Norman sovereignty. Let the Angevin destroy himself fighting in Anjou. He does not understand us, the English barons. We are the people.
To what does this lead?
To a happy coalition of intelligent interests. For a powerful party which has turned its eyes in your direction to gain from you, your lordship asks. For us, church favour would be an advantage. Blessing of Pope, a powerful protection in the fight for liberty. You, my lord, in being with us, would fight a good stroke at once for England and for Rome, ending the tyrannous jurisdiction of King's Court over Bishop's Court, of King's Court over Baron's Court.
Pursue your treacheries as you've done before. No one shall say that I betrayed a king.
Then, my lord, I shall not wait at your door. And I well hope before another spring, the king will show you his regard for your loyalty.
To make, then break, this thought has come before. The desperate exercise of failing power. Samson in Gaza did no more. But if I break, I must break myself alone.
Well done, Thomas. Your will is hard to bend, but with me beside you, you shall not lack a friend.
Who are you? I expected 3 visitors, not 4.
Do not be surprised to receive one more.
Say what you come to say.
As for the king, his hardened hatred shall have no end. You know truly the king will never trust twice the man who has been his friend.
What is your counsel?
Fast forward to the end. All other ways are closed to you, except the way already chosen.
That I do not understand.
It is not for me to tell you how this may be so. I am only here, Thomas, to tell you what you know.
How long shall this be?
Save what you know already. Ask nothing of me. But think, Thomas. Think of glory after death. When a king is dead, there's another king. And one more king is another reign. King is forgotten when another shall come. Saint and martyr rule from the tomb. Think, Thomas, think of enemies dismayed, creeping in penance, frightened of a shade. Think of pilgrims standing in line before a glittering jewel shrine, from generation to generation, bending the knees in supplication. Think of the miracles by God's grace, and think of your enemies in another place.
I have thought of these things.
And that is why I tell you, your thoughts have more power than kings to compel you.
But what is there to do? What is to be done? Is there not an enduring crown to be won?
Yes, Thomas, yes. You have thought of that too. Seek the way of martyrdom. Make yourself the lowest on earth to be high in heaven.
No! Who are you, tempting me with my own desires? What do you ask? What do you seek?
I offer what you desire. I ask what you have to give. Is it too much for such a vision of eternal grandeur?
Others offered real goods. Worthless, but real. You only offer dreams to damnation.
Now is the way clear, now is the meaning plain. Temptation shall not come in this kind again. The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right deed for the wrong reason. 30 years ago, I searched all the ways that lead to pleasure, advancement, and praise. Ambition comes when early force is spent, and we find no longer all things possible. When I imposed the king's law in England, and waged war with him against Toulouse, I beat the barons at their own game. I could then despise the men who thought me most contemptible, the raw nobility whose manners matched their fingernails. When I ate out of the king's dish, to become servant of God was never my wish. I know what yet remains to show you of my history will seem to most of you at best futility, senseless self-slaughter of a lunatic, arrogant passion of a fanatic. I shall no longer act or suffer to the sword's end. Now my good angel, whom God appoints to be my guardian, hover over the sword's points.
Today. What is today? Another night and another dawn.
What day is the day that we always hope for or fear for? Every day should be the day that we fear from or hope from. One moment weighs like another. Only in retrospection selection, We say that was the day, the critical moment that is always now and here. Even now in sordid particulars the eternal design may appear.
Servants of the king, we rode hard.
Urgent business from the king.
By the king's order. Our men are outside.
We must speak with you alone. This is the matter.
Of your earlier misdeeds I shall make no mention. They're too well known. But after dissension had ended in France, and you were endued with your former privilege, how did you show your gratitude? You had fled from England, not exiled nor threatened, mind you, but in the hope of stirring up trouble in the French dominions. You sowed strife abroad. You reviled the king to the King of France, to the Pope, raising up against him false opinions.
Yet the king, out of his charity, urged by your friends, offered clemency, made a pact of peace, all disputes ended, sent you back to your see as you demanded.
And burying the memory of your transgressions, restored your honours and your possessions. All you sued for you were granted. Yet how, I repeat, did you show your gratitude?
These are the facts. Say therefore, if you are content, to answer in the king's presence, therefore were we sent.
Never was it my wish to uncrown the king's son or diminish his honour and power. I would wish him 3 crowns rather than 1. And as for the bishops, it is not my yoke that is laid upon them, nor mine to revoke. Let them go to the Pope. It was he who condemned them.
Priest, you have spoken in peril of your life.
Priest, you have spoken in danger of the knife.
Priest, you have spoken treachery and treason.
Priest, traitor, confirmed in malfeasance.
I submit my cause to the judgment of Rome. But if you kill me, I shall rise from my tomb and submit my cause before God's throne.
Priest, monk, and servant, take hold, detain, restrain this man in the king's name.
Or answer with your bodies.
Enough of words. We come for the king's justice. We come with swords.
My lord, you cannot stop here.
Make haste! They're coming back, armed. To the altar! To the altar!
All my life they've been coming, these feet. All my life I have waited.
My lord, they are coming. They will break in presently. You will be killed.
Come to the altar. Don't stand here talking, my lord. It's not right. What shall become of us, my lord, if you are killed? What shall become of us?
Peace. Be quiet. Remember where you are and what is happening.
Seize him. Force him.
Drag him.
Keep your hands off.
Secure the door.
The door is secured. They dare not break in. We are safe.
They cannot break in. They have not the force.
Open the door. I will not turn this into a fortress.
Where is Becket, traitor to the king?
Where is Becket, the meddling priest?
Where is Becket, the faithless priest?
Absolve all those you have excommunicated.
Resign the powers you have arrogated.
Restore to the king the money you have appropriated.
Renew the obedience you have violated.
I am now ready to die. It is the just man who, like the bold lion, should be without fear. I'm here, no traitor to the king. I'm a priest.
Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!
We beg you to give us your attention for a few moments. We know that you may be disposed to judge unfavourably of our action. You are Englishmen, and therefore you believe in fair play, and when you see one man being set upon by 4, then your sympathies are all with the underdog. I respect such feelings. I share them. Nevertheless, I appeal to your sense of honour. You are Englishmen, and you will not judge anybody without hearing both sides of the case. I myself am not qualified to put our case to you. I am a woman of action and not of words. And for that reason, I shall do no more than introduce the other speakers, who, with their various abilities and different points of view, will be able to lay before you the merits of this extremely complex problem. The gist of the argument is this, that we have been completely disinterested, but our action requires more justification than that. And you should hear the other speakers.
I'm going to appeal not to your emotions, but to your reason. You are hard-headed, sensible people, as I can see, and not to be taken in by emotional claptrap. I therefore ask you to consider soberly, what were the Archbishop's aims? And what are King Henry's aims? In the answer to these questions lies the key to the problem. The King's aim has been perfectly consistent. He intended that Becket, who had proved himself an extremely able adviser, no one denies that, should unite the office of Archbishop and Chancellor. Had Becket concurred with the King's wishes, we should have had an almost ideal state. A union of spiritual and temporal administration under a central government. And what happened? The moment that Becket, at the King's instant, had been made Archbishop, he resigned from office of Chancellor. He became more priestly than the priest. He affirmed immediately that there was no higher order than which our king, and he as the king's servant, had for so many years strived to establish, and that God knows why the two orders were incompatible. You will agree with me that such an interference by an archbishop offends the people like ours. I know I have your approval. I read it on your faces. It is only with the measure of which we have had to adopt in order to set the matter right that you take issue. No one regrets the necessity of violence more than we do. Unhappily, there are times when violence is the only way in which social justice can be secured, and at another time you would condemn an archbishop a vote of parliament and execute him formally as a traitor, and no one would have to bear the burden of being called a murderer. We have been instrumental in setting about the state of affairs that you approve. We served your interest. We merit your applause. And if there is any guilt whatever in the matter, you must share it with us.
What I have to say may be put in the form of a question. Who killed the Archbishop? As some of you have been eyewitnesses of this lamentable scene, you may feel some surprise at my putting it in this way, but consider the course of events. While the late Archbishop was Chancellor, no one under the King did more to weld the country together, to give it the sense of unity, stability, order, tranquility and justice it's so badly needed. From the moment he became Archbishop, he completely reversed his policy. He showed himself to be utterly indifferent to the fate of the country, to be in fact a monster of egotism, a menace to society. And that egotism grew upon him until it became at last an undoubted mania. Every attempt to restore him to reason failed. Now, I have unimpeachable evidence to the effect that before he left France, he clearly prophesied in the presence of numerous witnesses he had not long to live. He would be killed in England. He used every means of provocation from his conduct, step by step. There can be no inference except that he had determined upon death by martyrdom. Even at the last, he could have given us reason. He could have kept himself from us long enough to allow our righteous anger to cool. Need I say more? I think with these facts before you, you will unhesitatingly render a verdict of suicide while of unsound mind. It's the only charitable verdict you can give upon one who was, after all, a great man.
Oh, Father, Father, gone from us, lost to us, how shall we find you? From what far place do you look down on us? You, now in heaven, who shall now guide us, direct us, protect us? After what journey? Through what further dread shall we recover your presence? When inherit your strength? The church lies bereft, alone, desecrated, desolated, and the heathen shall build on the ruins, their world without God. I see it, I see it.
The church is stronger for this action triumphant in adversity. It is fortified by persecution, supreme, so long as men will die for it. Go, weak, sad men, lost erring souls, homeless in earth and heaven. Go where the sunset reddens the last grey rock of Brittany or the gates of Hercules. Go venture shipwreck on the sullen coasts, where blackamoors make captive Christian men. Go to the northern seas, confined with ice, where the dead breath makes numb the hand, makes dull the brain. Find an oasis in the desert sun. Go seek alliance with the heathen Saracen to share his filthy rites, and try and snatch forgetfulness in his libidinous courts, oblivion in the fountain by the date tree. Or sit and bite your nails in Aquitaine. In the small circle of pain within the skull, you still shall tramp and tread one endless round of thought to justify your actions to yourselves, weaving a fiction that unravels as you weave, pacing forever in the hell of make-believe that never is belief. This is your fate on earth, and we must think no further of you.
Now, in the sight of God, conjoined with all the saints and martyrs gone before you, remember us.
Let our thanks ascend to God, who has given us another saint in Canterbury.